Okay, so in the first phase, we talked about basically philosophy. What's your underlying philosophy for why you're doing your show the way you're doing it, what you want it to achieve? You know, the essential question I really think is important. What is the experience you want your audience to have? You flesh out your stuff around that, and now we get to the second phase, which I think of as structure, defining like what your structural approach is going to be. If you look around, like if you're into hypnotism and you've watched enough videos or you've caught enough shows, or if you work in the industry, which you probably do if you're watching this video, you'll see that there's probably, I would say maybe like 3 main structural approaches to stage hypnotism shows. The first one would be, I think is the most common one, is maybe there's an official thing for this, but this is what I think of. It's all my terminology, stay with me, is the quilt structure, right? There's a real prevalence in stage hypnotism for hypnotists to basically, they collect bits, right? That's what they watch shows, they watch videos, they collect a bit, and they collect a bit, and then they catch another video or another show, and they collect a bit, and they collect a bit, and they're basically doing it on just, you know, what they think is fun, or what they just think is good. And so they collect these bits and they end up putting it all together so that it makes one overall, you know, reasonably cohesive show, right? Like putting the pieces of a patchwork quilt together so that you finally have one finished product made of all these separate pieces of material. And we talk about shows in terms of material, right? Content. So to me, it's a pretty useful metaphor. So there's this quilt structure. That's one thing you could do. It's not wrong. It's not bad. I just think it involves the least amount of craftsmanship. Because again, what you're really doing is you're collecting bits. Usually, this is the way I see it in the industry, is you're collecting bits, which means you're not even coming up with anything yourself that's original. You're taking bits from other people, and then the common thing is you adjust them. The common phrase you'll hear stage hypnotists say is, how do I make that my own? I take this bit I saw, how do I refashion it and adjust it so that it feels like it's really original to me? And that's fine. Again, like that, I did that in the early part of my career. I think it's a process, the way that this profession is developed, that a lot of people end up going through. The problem I see is that a lot of people don't ever graduate beyond this. They don't evolve as an artist beyond this. I think the other thing you can do, it's much less common, is you can have a narrative arc. We live in a storytelling culture. We're used to telling stories. And a lot of forms of entertainment, either explicitly or covertly, follow some form of a traditional narrative arc, telling a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Or in more classic literature, there's your beginning, and then there's a building arc up to a moment of climax, and then what, you know, the old term in literature is denouement, the untying of knots, that on the bottom end, on the back end. You could approach your show this way. You could say, do I want to string together skits, scenes, experiences that somehow each builds upon the last and works them toward a final climactic experience, and then, you know, and then ends off and ties up all the loose ends. This is pretty rare because I think a lot of people don't think of stage hypnotism as really a story, but it is an available model. So again, what you would do is you'd start with literally, you know, the beginning, your pre-talk, your induction, you're building the energy up until you get to some kind of a big final moment, and then you come down off of that final moment. So again, let's think of like pre-talk, then think of like here, induction, then this whole section here would be all your in hypnotic terms, it'd be all your utilization. So you could utilization, or you could just think of it as all the core suggestions that you're doing. You get to your climax here, and then you get to your end point, and that is usually, that's emergence, plus maybe some folks like to do post-hypnotics that go past the emergence point, right? So in terms of hypnotic function and entertainment function, that's kind of how it would all blend together. It's not, not particularly sexy, but functional. The third model is almost, I think, again, I'm making all this up, right? Like there might be other people who have used these same terms or stuff. This is just me saying this is how I've thought about it for the past 19 years as I've grown and developed as a hypnotist and an entertainer. The third possibility is this is the way I have really thought about my show for years and years, is that you're basically you're operating an improv troupe with no trained improv actors. So you get in, and I don't have a way of visually representing this one so much, but you get in, you get your volunteer group, and you get them into hypnosis, and then you just keep putting improv skits in front of them, really, through the building of suggestion, right? The delivery of suggestion, where you're transforming these people into a cast of characters, and in hypnosis, their creativity comes out, and you let them become those characters or exhibit those phenomena, right? But that's what they're really all doing. They're all serving as your cast of characters, and it's your job to facilitate this improv troupe experience in a way that's interesting to the audience. So you're the facilitator, you're the Drew Carey on the, what's that, whose line is it anyway? You're Drew Carey telling them what to do, and then they're your Wayne Brady and your Ryan Stiles and all those guys, and you're doing it that way. I think these are probably the three main, and again, if any of you are watching this and you have a different way, please, by all means, leave it in the comments, leave it in your, drop it somewhere, I don't know. But, so for me, this is what I'm familiar with. I used to kind of do this. I used to do the quilt approach in the early part of my career, and then around 2010, I was already feeling myself moving more and more to this. I was realizing that what I was having the most fun doing was turning people into characters, and I was thinking more and more about how I could do that more and more purposefully. And then when I came up with mind games, I was really the big proposition, unique selling proposition for mind games was that the audience gets to vote on what happens. So that was a structural component, right? Well, I had to plan it so that I could be ready at any point to do what the audience voted on, but I was in control of all of that ultimately. And I was really thinking from a creative standpoint of this all the time. How can I take total strangers off the street, get them into hypnosis to a deep enough level where their flow state was achieved, where their creativity was really coming out, and then how do I create interesting improv troupe skits that I could give them as hypnotic suggestions and let them step into those characters and become those characters. That is what I would still favor moving off of phase one, and I have it here. I'm gonna layer this as I keep doing these videos for you guys. Remember, what I really want to achieve is I want to have a show that's focused on what people love about music, the different cultural ways in which people experience music in a way that activates them emotionally, gets them excited, makes them feel inspired, makes them feel loved, and that creates a feeling of novelty. And that's my sort of cycle that I'm trying to go through in my planning, right? So this is my conceptual, philosophical starting point, phase one. And now for me, I'm like, okay, my instinct for now is I still want to do that through the structure of an improv troupe. I want to get people hypnotized. I want to deepen their hypnotic state, and then I want to create structure that lets them be an improv troupe where I give them scenarios, they step into certain character positions, and the music enhances everything. And sometimes the music will really be the focus, sometimes it won't be so much the focus. But I think one of the things that's really different for me on this from my old show, which I'm still doing, by the way, I still love mind games and I do it. This is something I'm actively working toward as a new project, but it's going to take a while. The other thing I want to think about is this: the improv troupe used to always be, the troupe itself was the volunteers, right? It was the volunteers. Well, what I also want to think about now is, how do I get the audience more involved? I think that's another thing that I learned from doing mind games. Part of the reason that mind games was so well received was it gave the audience a real feeling that they had an impact on the show and that they were involved throughout the course of the show. And so I would like to take that to another level. Now, is the audience going to be the improv troupe? Probably not, but I'll stay open to thinking about it. But how do I get them somehow, is this a complete and true bifurcation where, I don't know. This is what I have to keep thinking about more and more. But I want to be conscious as I structure the design of my show for both things. I don't want the audience just passively sitting there and consuming the show the whole time. I want them involved somehow, because what I learned, one of the biggest lessons I learned from creating mind games was that when you keep them involved, they appreciate it more and they really like feeling involved. So that's something to think about. So structure. Now, the last component of this, all right, is, so for me, if I'm going to, I might be running out of real estate here, but the scenarios themselves is, how much of the scenarios are group scenarios? And how many of them, how often are they individual scenarios? So that's the other thing. As I move structurally, to me, this is important. I want to be able to explain this to you in a way that is really helpful. I think a lot of hypnotists take for granted their show structure and how the rhythm of the show and the development of the show is affected by how often you're keeping the whole group involved on stage and how often all of the focus comes down to an individual or maybe just two people. And there's a hypnotic function aspect of this that's really important. What people need in order to maintain their hypnotic state is task orientation. If you just leave a hypnotized person sitting on stage and you don't acknowledge them at all and you don't include them at all, they're going to lose state. They're not going to maintain the hypnotic state indefinitely. They'll snap out of it. So you have to make sure when you're designing your show structurally that there's a structural thing planned in that keeps everybody involved often enough so that that task orientation, that utilization that's happening hypnotically, keeps them in state and keeps them going. And if anything, gets them going deeper. It increases their level of absorption and makes them a more responsive, more interesting hypnotic subject. If you're not doing that, you risk just losing people. So for me, this is not just a little add-on thing. As we move from, all right, which one of these structures do I feel like best about, that I want to use? That's the next level. Is okay, so as I move now to what I would call phase 3, which is, really starting to try to figure out content. At first, all that matters is just getting ideas for content. But then as you're in that process, and that'll be the longest part of this process, is as you're generating ideas for content and you're working things out, you're going to start wanting to identify which ones would be group scenarios, which one would be individual scenarios, and how do you position them and order them in a way that makes your total product better. Hope that makes sense. Hope you find that helpful. That's phase 2, structure. Talk more soon.